I don't know where to stand. I guess I'll stand between you guys. Hi, welcome everybody. Normally I ask if there's anyone in the audience who has never been in the building before, but I think everyone has. Is there anyone who's brand new? Welcome, welcome. Come back, please. I'm Diana Ingram. I'm the executive director here at Hill Center at the Old Naval Hospital. Welcome to our friends on Facebook Live. We're thrilled to have you. Please take a moment to turn off your mobile devices. It is such a pleasure to welcome you all here. Take a moment to look at your programs. We have a lot of exciting things coming up, including a talk moderated with Diana Parcells about Eliza Scidmore. It's a book written by Diana Parcells, moderated by Stephanie Deutsch, who should be a familiar name to many of you folks sitting in the audience. So definitely plan to come and hear about how the cherry blossom trees ended up in Washington, D.C. So very time appropriate. This strand, Talk of the Hill with Bill Press, was created by Bill as part of his desire to turn the Old Naval Hospital into a world-class Center for Arts and Humanities Programming. And I would say that he has certainly delivered on that promise. He has interviewed, as part of this, Representative John Lewis. That was quite a moment, actually, here at Hill Center. In addition to bishops and nuns and Supreme Court justices and, oh my goodness, fabulous authors, the most interesting authors of our time. It's a real pleasure to welcome Martin Walker, author of many books, at least 17, if not 20, I understand, or in between. Anyway, welcome to Talk of the Hill with Bill Press. Bill, as you know, is an insanely fabulous conversationalist. He knows something about just about everything. He's an award-winning journalist, author of 10 books on his own. I'm sure there's another one coming out soon, right? Mm-hmm. That we'll be doing a book party for. Anyway, as per usual, Bill and Martin will be in conversation for about half an hour, and then we'll open it up to Q&A and pass around the microphone. Please wait for the microphone. But most importantly, there are books for sale, and Martin is going to sign them. Not only the beloved series, but this brand new foray into cooking. And anyway, thank you very much for being here, and thank you, Bill, and thank you, Martin.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diana.
Thank you.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out this evening. I'm so excited to welcome a good friend, Martin Walker, to the Hill Center, and to welcome all of you. I want to borrow a page from Diana and ask you, how many have already read at least one of Martin Walker's books?
Like
Whoa!
no pressure.
Okay. And now, how many of you have already been to the Dordogne in France? Martin, this is your crowd. So, obviously, I don't think Martin needs an introduction in this room, but I'm going to give him a short one anyhow, because some of you may not know that before he became Mr. Bruno, Martin was a very accomplished and well-known journalist here in Washington for The Guardian and for UPI, also was a bureau chief for The Guardian in Moscow, and wrote a few books, at any rate, serious books about foreign policy, the Cold War and U.S.-Soviet relations. And then he up and moved to the Dordogne and reinvented himself as a writer of these great mysteries, the great Bruno mystery series, of course, about Bruno, the police chief of Saint-Denis, this little village in the Dordogne. Martin tells me he is now working on number 18 in the series, so that's good news, right? We've more to look forward to if you've already read 17 so far. A series that has been immensely popular. In fact, Martin he's won many awards, one of which was the Prix Charbonnier, which Martin received from the Alliance Française for doing the most to advance French culture. And, I might add, only the second American to win that award, and the only other American to win it was Julia Child. So in good company, indeed. And now, of course, he is just published last year, end of last year, Bruno's Cookbook, which those of us who have read so much Bruno are not surprised, because half of Bruno's books, the Bruno books, are about food and wine and cheese and truffles and on and on. So, Martin, it's a great pleasure to welcome you here. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Bill. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be back in DC, where our daughters grew up, and where we have so many friends, and it's just a real pleasure to get to know this particular part of DC, Capitol Hill, which I really only knew as the Capitol, rather than as this sort of much more interesting quartier, little quarter that I've come across. And but I have been struck by the way in which American habits are getting into France. I mean, when I was last at meeting somebody at a station, but my person I was meeting was going to the local Starbucks and came back outraged by apparently being insulted by the barista. And I had to explain, it's just the standard French roast. Sorry.
All right.
Yeah.
So tell us, how did you make this leap, reinventing yourself from nonfiction writer to suddenly these wonderful mystery stories? What was the occasion?
It began really when my wife Julia said to me, and Julia had been with me around the world and in Moscow for years and Washington and stuff, and was writing and wrote about food from time to time for the Washington Post. And Julia said, look, we're a pair of footloose foreign correspondents. We've got these children. We need to have a fixed place. And I said, as husbands do, oh, jolly good idea, and forgot all about it. And we were actually staying, as we did most summers, for a couple of weeks with friends of ours who lived in this region, a French couple. And I had to fly back to Washington. I had an interview set up with Clinton. This was just before the big anniversary summit of NATO's foundation 50 years earlier. And I was in the anteroom to the Oval Office, and my portable phone rang. Now, you remember what they were like in those days. They were not the sleek little slim things of today. But anyway, I sort of manhandled this thing, and it was Julia saying, I don't care what you're doing. You should drop everything and get the next plane back to France. I've found our house. I'd entirely forgotten we were meant to be looking for a house, as many women would not be surprised to learn most husbands do. But I said, well, Clinton, White House. But a few days later, I was on the plane back to France, and indeed that's where we've been ever since. And while I was there, in that very first summer, we had a long break, and I became fascinated by the fact that the last generation of the résistants of World War II was dying out. So I made a point of going around and visiting and interviewing as many as I possibly could. And I was particularly struck by one thing which had been pretty much left out of most of the histories, which was that the people planning D-Day, the British and American generals planning it, were very frightened of one German unit. It was an SS Panzer division called Das Reich. And an SS division is always twice the size of an ordinary one. This was the most powerful single armored force in Western Europe, 22,000 men, really newly re-equipped with the latest tanks. They were down at Montauban near Toulouse, which was the armor proving grounds for the French army. They were 3 days from the Normandy beaches under normal circumstances. And the British and American planners said to the resistance, whatever you do, slow these bastards down. Whatever the cost, slow them down. And they managed to blow up bridges, they managed to delay them, they managed to attack the trains that were bringing the fuel and so on. The fact is, this strongest armoured force that the Germans had did not reach Normandy for 3 weeks. Every single day was bought with French blood. And so when I hear people joke about, cheese-eating banana, cheese-eating surrender monkeys, I get very cross. What the French did at that time was really a heroic effort. And so I began researching into all of this, and I wrote a book partly about that, but also mixed in with the prehistoric caves of Lascaux, a book called The Caves of Périgord, in which these two stories come together. And that was my first effort at fiction. And then I just became friendly with more and more local people, in particular the local policeman, whose name is Pierrot. And
What?
Pierrot, well, Pierre, but often...
I know, but not Bruno.
Well, when I wrote the first draft, here comes Julia again. So when I wrote the first draft, I wrote it and I named it, after Pierrot. Blah, blah. And Julia read it and she said, You know how wives sometimes have that little noise. You might have something here, she said, but you can't possibly call him Pierrot. You want an international name, something like Bruno. And then she said, now, Julia had worked in publishing for a while. She said, look, you publishers like to think there might be a series. So go away and write 5 short paragraphs, one on each of the next 5 in the series. Yes, ma'am. So I went off and, scratched my head, and within about 3 months, we'd been sold in Germany, America, Japan, blah, blah, blah. I mean, Julia was absolutely right. Julia, as you're beginning to realize, is always right.
Is there a Saint-Denis?
Yes.
This village actually exists?
Not quite.
Oh.
I chose Saint-Denis because it's the most common name for any town in France. And it's based upon a town called Le Buge, which is close to where the rivers Vézère and Dordogne come together. And Le Buge is a town of just over 2,500 people. It goes back to certainly to the 9th century, we know from historical records. And it's mostly Saint-Denis, except it's a very boring 19th century church that was built with the tobacco boom. So I brought in a much better church from Trémola, just down the road, which is a beautiful church dating back to the 5th century. And indeed, Charlemagne sort of gave money to rebuild it, and Charlemagne actually gave it things that are called swaddling clothes, but in fact turns out, according to legend, to have been a rather soiled nappy belonging to the baby Jesus, which was of extraordinary value at the time. But then we're full of these things, just as a wonderful monastery nearby called Cadouin, which is still on the route for the road to Compostela. And for years, for centuries, Cadouin was famous because it had the funeral draping cloth of Jesus, which had been bought by the very gullible King Richard the Lionheart and brought back to France, where he was the Count of the Périgord, and he donated it to the abbey. And for 8 centuries, every year there were these huge celebrations. Great masses were told, and it wasn't until the 1930s that one of the monks, who was something of a scholar, actually looked very closely at the engravings on this and found out it was an 11th century funeral shroud of Muslim origin, and the line across it said, Allah is great and Muhammad is a prophet. So I'm sure Jesus didn't mind. But,
So, all right, so we know the Saint-Denis, Le Buge. How about Bruno? How about Pamela? How about the Baron? Are they real people?
The Baron is also real.
Ah.
We've always had Basset hounds in our family, and of course, they are the finest dogs you can possibly imagine. I mean, they're brave and devoted and so on. And when the very first summer we were there, I was just finishing off a long essay I was writing for somebody, and there was a knock on my door, and there is this elderly gentleman whom I'd seen in this little village outside of Le Bourg where we lived, and he was the man who lived in the Chartreuse, the small chateau, and he was known to everybody as the Baron. And he knocked on the door, and I answered it, and there he is with my dog, who apparently had found a way out through the hedge and escaped, and the Baron had just rescued it, and he brought it back, and I said, well, this is very kind of you. Could I offer you a glass of whiskey? And I happened to have close to a full bottle, and we nearly finished it that night. And I then found myself embraced into his circle. And on next Friday morning, I was taken down to the local tennis club, where I was meant to be playing elderly gentlemen's tennis, you know, the kind where you have a glass of wine by the side of the net, with the Baron and a couple of other guys, and with our local village policeman, Pierrot. And this was, we began at 10:30, we went on to just after noon, and then with the really serious stuff was we were setting up lunch in the local tennis club. And in any self-respecting French tennis club, the kitchen is by far the biggest part of the clubhouse. And before I knew where I was sort of adopted into the... once they were clear that I was Scottish rather than English, they were much more understanding.
So it's about, your book's about the people and about the land, the Dordogne, certainly a very special region. I ask you about in the cookbook for a second. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but in your Poulo Po recipe, you quote Henry IV, who says about the Périgord, and you should maybe mention Dordogne and Périgord also. Henry IV said, described it as, quote, good cuisine and good wines. This place is paradise on earth.
Yep. He also had an eye for the women as well. He thought they were jolly pretty. He's everybody's favourite French king.
So what makes the Dordogne so special?
There are, I think, three things. The first one is the cuisine is distinctive because we're right on the boundary between the area which cooks with butter in the north and the area to the south which cooks with olive oil. And we cook with duck fat, which turns out that it's very healthy. We've got the lowest incidence of heart disease of anywhere in Europe.
Really?
Really.
Oh.
So that's one thing. That is a really distinctive part of the cuisine. I think a second part of it is that we're not really French. All of the French people are, as you will probably know from your Asterix, you know, they're all taught that our ancestors, the Gauls. Not so. The ancestors of most of the French are the Franks. And the Franks come from a place in central Germany called Franconia. And the truth is that most of the French are a bunch of krauts by inheritance. And we down in this particular chosen part of Old Gaul, we come from an area, the name Périgord comes from the Petracori, which was the name of the local tribes, which means in Gallic, it means the 5 families, or the 5 tribes. But Julius Caesar, who was struck by how mightily they fought against him, was struck by what he thought was a Latin phrase which meant hearts of rock, because that was the way he thought they fought. And they fought him all the way to the very end with Vercingetorix at the Battle of Alesia and so on. But then they became good Roman, Gallo-Romans. But I mean, we kept that same language of Occitan, which is very like Provençal, it's very like Catalonia. In fact, people can understand Catalans with each other. And they were not at all Franks. They weren't really French. And until quite recently, children in school were punished if they spoke their native Occitan. But most of the old people still speak it. I speak it a bit. I mean, it's one of those distinctive things about this particular part of the world. So the cooking is one bit. I think this tradition of Occitan is a second. And the third one is the extraordinary pride people have in the fact that most of what we know about prehistoric people comes from that valley of the river Vézère. I mean, those of you who have been there will probably have been to Lascaux, this extraordinary cave, which is, well, Picasso was one of the early people to go and see it, and he came out and said, "We have met our masters. We have learned nothing in all of these thousands of years." The great French archaeologist, the Abbé Breuil, said, "This is the Sistine Chapel of prehistoric mankind." And so it is. But equally, one thing we learned from it, it was not just mankind, because there were enough handprints on the walls of these caves. And as you know, there's a slight difference between male and female digit proportions. It was also womankind who were doing the painting. And it's lovely to be able to say that, because until relatively recently, people just assumed that all of the cave artists had been men. Not so. Thank you, ladies.
And in Les Caves du Périgord, you tell that story of the first woman artist, if you will.
I do.
Beautiful.
Well, I didn't know about it at the time, but I wanted to have a woman artist in there. But I also tell the story about this great battle with the German SS Panzer.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next. That one side of, and Carol and I have been to Lascaux before. You now see the faux Lascaux, but it's still magnificent. That I didn't realize the role that the caves played with the resistance.
Yeah.
Tell us a little about that.
Well, a bit of it gets fanciful because Malraux, who was, André Malraux was one of the great romantic writing literary characters of the 1930s, wrote about the Chinese Revolution, led a volunteer group of pilots in the Spanish Civil War and so on, and later became a leading figure in the resistance. But he liked to claim in his rather grandiose memoirs that he'd actually hidden guns in the cave of Lascaux, which turns out to have been a little bit fanciful, but often guns were being hidden there. There's a cave very near my house that's called Barabahau, and certainly guns and ammunition were hidden there. There's another one which is just up the hill from me, which is it's known as the Grotto. It's a huge, great underground cave or a cavern. No painting in it; it's just far too big for that. But that place was also being used to hide weapons, including weapons being hidden by the Baron's father. And so one got a sort of a sense of all of this. And my next door neighbor, Joe, now almost 90 years old, I mean, he was a little young, as a boy, he was carrying messages for the resistance. And he told me that there immediately after the liberation of the town, as a child, he stood watching as the collaborators were brought out, posed on the side of the bridge, bang, 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 and just pushed into the river. I mean, it was rough times then, but a lot of it was for. Remember that throughout the war, there were something like 1.6 million French prisoners of war in German prison camps, in effect hostages for French good behavior. And think of the women left behind, many of them with young children, and having to go to the local pro-Vichy, pro-Nazi police called the milice to get their ration books to feed their kids. And it was standard for the bloody milice to demand sexual favors in return for this. There's another village quite near to me which was famous because the women got hold of 3 militiamen and kicked them to death with the only shoes they had, which were wooden sabots. And one entirely understands why.
Sort of as a transition to the cookbook,
Yeah,
I couldn't believe as a
that's an easy one.
as a Francophile, I couldn't believe so much talk in the Bruno books about wine made with walnuts, vin de noix. I mean,
I make it myself every year.
mon Dieu, what?
I make it myself. Before the Saint Jean, which is the 22nd of June, we go out and we pick the green walnuts. The nuts haven't formed; they're just green skin and white inside. And you chop them up. We get about 40 to 50. You chop them up. Chop them up and put them into a big faitout, which is a big French metal enamel pot. You pour in 8 litres of not very good wine. It doesn't matter at this stage, plus a litre of not entirely legal eau de vie. And you stir them all up. The French will toss in a kilo of sugar, which I think makes it too sweet. I put in half a kilo, stir it up, leave it for 6 weeks, and the good Lord does his magic. It's delicious. It's a fortified wine, a slightly sweet wine, but with this nutty flavour to it, and it's so easy to make. I mean, even I can't go wrong.
So Bruno's cookbook is the result. Of course, again, if you've read the Bruno books, you know so much of it is about food and wine and truffles and cheese, and it's all together here in an absolutely stunningly beautiful book. The photographs are some of the best I've ever seen in any cookbook. And what really struck me is that it's pure poetry. Now, I don't know whether to thank you or Julia for that, but just let me read it. Here's a little from the introduction. The Perigord itself has been a wonderful teacher and an inspiration. How could one deny the urge to cook, given the splendid taste of the vegetables that come from our own potager? How could we taste the apples and pears, the cherries and apricots and peaches that come from our fruit trees, and not ponder ways to cook with or preserve this great bounty? It's all there. It's just so beautiful. So congratulations.
Thank you.
Right?
Thank you.
But I do have to ask you the question I'm sure that's on everyone's mind, and has been mine since I paged through this cookbook. Where do you get duck fat? And what do you use if you can't get duck fat?
Well, you can get duck fat. You can get it in Eastern
No.
Market.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The Eastern
Right.
Market? They sell it?
Pike, the poultry.
All right, I stand corrected. Carol, did you know that?
$5.99.
But you can also get it online. So
Okay, but can you,
you can also get it online.
you can get it online? Okay.
Yeah.
And can you substitute anything for duck fat?
Yes, you can substitute walnut oil, which we also have an awful lot of.
Uh-huh.
I mean, one of the things about France is that the French have a lot of little sort of secrets. And one of their secrets is the French adore almost nothing quite so much as getting dressed up in costumes and having a communal feast. And the way they do this is they have things called confréries, or brotherhoods. And so around the Perigord, we've got confréries for noix, which are walnuts. We've got them for hazelnuts. We've got them for truffles. We've got them for cep mushrooms, which are like the Italians call them porcini. Yeah. We've got them for foie gras. We've got them for veau sur la mer. Now, this is a veal which has been raised only under the mother on the milk. And if you want to show off your credentials to a Perigord farmer who is trying to sell you this particular kind of veal, you go to the tail, you lift it up, and you pull apart the flesh. And if there is any red vein to be seen in the little white flesh around the anus, you know it was not raised only under the mother. That red vein is a telltale that it has not been only milk. So
I'll bet you didn't know that before you came tonight. Learned something. So, I mentioned the poule au pot, or chicken in a pot. That's a dish with a famous French history, of course. Is that the classic French country meal?
It is certainly one of them. Henri IV, Henry IV, was a local guy from the southwest of France, and he was a Protestant in the French wars of religion. But when he got to Paris, he was about to take Paris, and he thought, well, rather than have a bloody battle, he said, Paris is worth a mass. And he agreed to go and do a Catholic mass and to be a nominal Catholic to end the war. And of course, he found himself later assassinated by a rabid Jesuit priest. But anyway, Henry IV, who was a great ladies' man, he was known as a vert galant, a gallant green, which in French terms means a man for the ladies. But he won, I think, the hearts of the French people, partly because he ended the war, partly because he was very heroic, partly because he loved his food and his wine and the ladies, and partly because he said, it is my ambition that every French family on a Sunday should have a chicken in the pot. And I can't think of any French prime minister, president, until the socialist Léon Blum in the 1930s, who could have said such an ambition for the French people to be able to eat well. And so I got a great sort of fondness for him, and so do the French people. In fact, poule au pot, it depends pretty much upon the quality of the chicken. So anything you buy from a supermarket is not going to work. And so, well, we raise our own chickens back there in France, and that's the best way. I mean, because they're eating such a different kind of range of foods, and they will not be 55 days old, which they tend to be in the supermarket. When our chickens will be well into 7, 8, 9 months, and that's how it should be. And you can't believe the difference between the eggs that you get from chickens who've been pottering around a French garden and those who haven't. So, yeah, Henry IV, eggs, chickens, it's a classic dish.
And truffles. What role do they play, and do you hunt your own truffles?
I do. We have truffles all year round. Well, we have them in the summer, and they are rather brown. But the great thing about even the summer truffles is you never put your eggs in the fridge. You put your eggs in a sort of an earthenware pot with a top on it, and you put a truffle into it, because the egg shells are porous. And thanks to the beneficence of an understanding deity, the eggs therefore manage to draw in some of this heavenly scent of the truffles through the shell, and it lasts forever. So you'll be using the same truffle in there for 3 or 4 days before you finally weaken and you grate it into a scrambled egg thing, which is wonderful. But then we have the estivales in autumn, which are rather browner and rather more pungent in taste. And then early in December come the black diamonds, the diamants noirs. And they last until about mid-February. They can cost, I mean, up in Paris in the big hotels, they'll be paying 2,000, 3,000, 4,000 euros for a kilo of these things, and they just grow around where we are, and they really are delicious. Julia makes a wonderful creme brulee with them, which is sort of a combination of sweet and sour, which is tantalizing, and they. I mean, I make a. Would you believe? I've even made truffle omelets. They're so good. I mean truffle sandwiches. They're so good. But there we are, but it goes with. I like it with our local Bergerac wine, which is also one of the best kept secrets. You know, we were sort of held down for so long by those bastards in the Bordeaux, who, well, because we had to sort of ship our wine out through down the same river, down the Dordogne, and the Bordeaux people always wanted to sell off all of their wine before they even think about doing anything with our Bergerac wine. The result is that we are the best kept secret in wine in Europe. You get the best quality for the lowest price of anywhere in France. It's just, and I speak with the authority of being a Grand Consul de la Ville de Bergerac, a body that was founded in the year 1254. And I'm the first Scotsman in all that time. To be a Grand Consul. And I even make my own wine as well, a Cuvée Bruno, which I buy in the grapes from various friends. I've written about, for years, I wrote a monthly column about Bergerac wine for a local newspaper. And I took pride in the fact I was the only person writing only about Bergerac wine in the whole of France. And so I got to know most of the winemakers. I buy wine in from particular friends, and then through another friend, we make it together. And we make about 8,000 bottles a year. And we then came up against the challenge of the United States' claim to be a free trading nation. Because you aren't. If you want to export wine to America, then you have to send at least 6 and sometimes 12 bottles for free at your own expense to every one of the 50 states plus the District of Columbia, in order for the bureaucrats to satisfy themselves that what they will be tasting and drinking is fit for the palates of the American market. However, there is this, in this wonderful country of yours, there is often a way around such difficulties, and it's called Louisiana, which is convinced that it is really French, and actually has a bit of the French legal tradition to go with it. So I export my wine to America via Philippe's Wine Cellars in Lafayette, Louisiana. So if you're watching this on Facebook, Philippe's Wine Cellars, Lafayette, Louisiana, Bruno's, Cuvée Bruno is what you can do.
Okay.
But we're now selling several thousand bottles a year in Germany and other parts of Europe and so on, and I love it.
All right. Well, I don't know about you, but I'm getting hungry and thirsty. Bruno's cookbook, again, East City Books, our good friends, are here with a good selection of Bruno books for those of maybe one you haven't read yet or haven't read any at all, and Bruno's cookbook. And Martin will be glad to hang around and sign books for you as soon as we break up. But you must have lots of questions, so let me just stop there and throw it open to the floor. Anything? Yes, sorry. Yes.
Look over this way.
I will, thank you.
Wait 1 second.
Oh, I'm sorry. I should ask. Wait for the microphone, please, because we need to make sure we get everything on record. Yeah.
This is a segue from the truffles, but having spent a fair amount of time in the region of Saint-Rémy-de-Provence, we had truffles in the trees that were on the ridge line behind where the airport was. But we didn't go for walks there because there were armed guardians in the truffle areas because the truffles belonged to someone else.
Yeah.
And in the Bruno books, it sounds like you could just walk into somebody's oak forest and harvest your truffles if you had a smart basset hound.
You have to be quite clear about whose land you're on. But an awful lot of the land is pretty much open woodland. And there's a long tradition of the absentee landlord in the region. So, I mean, I just walk up the hillside and go looking for them. But there are places where I wouldn't. You're quite right. I mean, it can be tricky. But Bruno, of course, has planted his own. I mean, this is one of the points. Very early on in the Bruno series, I wrote about Bruno planting the green oaks that would be the future of the truffles, which is what sensible people do. What's bizarre is that you know, the actual harvest for truffles before the First World War was huge by comparison with what well over 100 tons a year. Now it's more like 30 to 35 tons. And part of that, I think, is to do with the decimation of the French peasantry in the trenches of World War I. I mean, the French lost over 2 million dead, which is, in a country of 40 million, is a shattering proportion.
So dogs or pigs or both?
Well, it is ill-advised to use pigs because they will fight. The truffle is rather like the sexual pheromone of the pig. So, and it's mainly the female pigs that will go hunting for them. And if you want to see somebody doing it the old way, they'll be like that in the market. They will lose their fingers. So these days we use dogs, and dogs are either trained or they're muzzled to prevent them.
And you talk in at least one of the books I read about, you see little flies that...
Oh yeah,
Yeah.
the little fly that will dance in the wintry sun's rays, and that's where you, when you see that fly, that's the truffle fly. That's where you know where to be.
Right, how we know.
Yeah. Well done.
Yeah.
But remember, you tap the ground first
Oh.
to get the fly to leap up and to.
Secrets of the truffle.
Wait.
I'm just curious, do you have a preference between foie gras de canard and foie gras de roi?
Ooh.
Boy.
I actually prefer the canard, and the reason is that, well, because the foie gras I prefer from the canard. The reason is that what I really like about foie is when you get it from the goose, and you cook it by its own, by itself. One of the great ways to cook a foie, a liver, from a goose, is that it's got quite enough fat to fry itself. So you get a pretty hot frying pan. You stuff in the goose. You then sing the Marseillaise to yourself, which timing is perfect. Then you turn it over, and as you are about to sort of to turn it out, to push it out, you will pour in a large jar of honey and stir it around, and then you can either use brandy, you can use wine, and that becomes a sauce. And I will often put in a little bit of honey mustard in there as well, and then I will use that as a sauce and pour it over the foie. But I much prefer goose for the straightforward foie, but for the foie gras I like the duck.
Well, there you go. Question this way? Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. If you want to learn how to render duck fat, you can take a cooking class here at the Hill Center with Mark Haskell, who is a member of the Confrérie de Saint-Vincent in the Vaucluse. But my
confrère.
Yes, he is a confrère.
Saint-Cheval.
Yeah. So my question has to do with the different police forces and your access beyond the community level, the gendarme, and then the national security forces. Did you have access to those higher level police? Because you write about the coordination and sometimes competition among them.
Well, I do now, because the books are pretty well known in France and so on, and so I've been given a guided tour of Dom by the people who run it. Dom is there's a hill in the beautiful hillside in the Dordogne, overlooking the Dordogne River, quite close to the chateau that was Josephine Baker's, and on the rear side of this hill, away from the beautiful touristy town, is the French Electronic Intelligence Listening Center, which is huge, and it is the French, along with the British, are, after the Americans and perhaps the Chinese, perhaps the leaders in this particular technology. And they, let me put it this way. I mean, the French have got They've still got Saint-Pierre-Miquelon off the coast of Canada. They've got places, they've got Guadeloupe, Martinique in the Caribbean. They've got Tahiti in the Pacific. They've got Ile de Réunion in the Indian Ocean, which is to say they have got listening posts all around the world, which is something that the Chinese don't have, the Russians don't have, and so on. I mean, we used to say the sun never set on the British Empire. The French have hung on to theirs and use it for all of this kind of stuff. So, yes, I've got to come across them. But in rural France, there will be, in not all communes, there will be a village policeman who is a policier municipal, and he's employed by the mayor and the council. And the original idea, it dates back to the Middle Ages when he would be a garde champêtre, or a country guard. Now, we've also got, in most of the rural areas, the gendarme. And in the rest of France, you have big cities and overall France. So in Paris alone, you've got a prefecture of police, which is its own Paris-run police operation. In the rest of France, you've got the Police Nationale, but the Police Nationale have a kind of a class system because either you're a member of the Police Judiciaire, which gives you pretty widespread arrest rights, or you're not. And the reason why the French do this is because it really goes back to the French Revolutionary and Napoleonic times when there was the first war of the police forces. And the French realized, or the French politicians realized, that it was really quite useful to have a gendarmerie which would not necessarily be taking the same political positions as your Police Nationale, least of all as the Préfecture de Police of Paris. So the French have very, very carefully divided their police forces to, if you like, to divide and rule. And this is something that is quite familiar, I think, to the British intelligence, where we've got MI5 and MI6, or in foreign intelligence domestic, or in the USA, where you've got the CIA and the FBI. And I quite understand, were I a politician, I would not want to give that much power to a single body running both FBI and CIA. So, sorry, that was a bit too long. It was an answer.
No, but it's an excellent question. And I was really
absolutely
confused by all these different levels and how they sometimes coordinated, but sometimes chose not to. I need the microphone first, please. Yeah. And then one more after this, and we're going to wrap. So if you have one more.
You write in English. When the books are translated into French, are they translated literally, or do you make changes?
I have a very good, my books are now being translated by somebody I trust and know very well. But I remember when the first one was translated, you've probably come across, if you know the books, a local French peasant soup called a turin. And a turin is, you can make it of anything, but basically you can do it with eggs and flour and a bit of cheese and potato, anything you've got to hand. But they chose a young Parisian translator to translate the book, and as I was reading it in proof, I came across this particular paragraph about, he mentions Turin, and he said, a soup made in the style of the town of Tours in the Loire. And I thought, if that gets published, I am going to be hanged in public. So I've taken various precautions since. Another tricky one I got was that there was one particular story in which Bruno had a friend who was an artist, a Russian artist who was living in the area, and this particular chap had erected in his bathroom, just at the height where a gentleman would stand to relieve himself, at eye level there was a small self-portrait of the artist giving a friendly male wink to whoever was standing there. And as I was sitting there, this was in Germany, and as my Deutsche Stimme, my German voice, was reading out this particular passage, because my German wasn't really good enough to go through the entire book, I was staggered to hear the German version say, als Bruno am Toilette satz. Nein, sitzt nicht, steht. He stands up to pickle. Which it turns out that my German editor, a woman, thought that it was better for men to seat themselves on the loo to pee. And I was stunned by this. Indeed, will many of the gentlemen here, I suggest. But there we are.
Well, wait a minute. How many languages are your books translated into?
18.
You've got a lot of work to do, dude. If you've got to check every one of them. One last question before we... okay, here we go. Yes, if we can get you... Oh, I'm sorry. There we go. Yes, didn't know.
I have a question. Will Bruno ever settle down?
Oh.
Well...
Let's hope not.
my British publisher is arguing that, Martin, it's quite clear that Florence is made for Bruno, and he loves her twins and so on. But
Not
I've
Pamela?
always listened to my wife, and Julia says, the moment Bruno settles down, you will lose half your readers.
Yes, so keep him going.
Which half?
Yeah. What a great evening, what a great friend, what a wonderful time. Thank you so much, Martin. Now, you know, we usually talk politics here, but we like to take a tangent once in a while, and as most of you who are regulars know, if we take a tangent, it's very often in the interest of food, like tonight. So, keeping that tradition going, I just want to give you a plug for next month, March 26th. Our guest is going to be Alex Prud'homme. Alex Prud'homme is the great-nephew of Julia Child. He wrote with her, authored with her, her final book, My Life in France, which actually he finished after she passed. And he wrote his new paperback of his book he published last year called Dinner with the President. He's going to be talking about that. It's a wonderful book about White House state dinners, famous dinners with presidents, what presidents like to eat, what presidents like to cook. It's a great book. So Alex Prud'homme will be here and we'll have, by the way, there are a lot of great recipes in his book as well. It's not a president's cookbook. It doesn't have such glorious things as this, but I hope I'm not giving away too much when I tell you that one of my favorite recipes, and not to make, but just to laugh about, is Dwight Eisenhower's recipe for squirrel stew. Anyhow, Alex Prud'homme, March 26th here at the Hill Center. Thank you all for coming. Thank you, Martin Walker.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.